I want to talk to you about Bill C-5 because you mentioned that as another example of declining democracy. And I have been criticized by some of my own viewers for saying Bill C-5 is a horrible bill because it centralizes, as you say, control in the federal cabinet and the prime minister's office. I see Mark Carney as another example of a prime minister who wants to centralize control within the PMO. And even Stephen Harper did that to some degree. And I worked on the Hill during the Harper years, and it was very difficult to do anything without the approval of the PMO. Certainly that continued under Justin Trudeau. I think Mark Carney is going to be the epitome. He's going to be emblematic of PMO power, and I think this bill represents that. But so many people have come to me and said, David, you're completely wrong about Bill C-5. The Conservatives fixed it. They solved the problems in this bill, and you should be saying it's a good bill. And Pierre Poilievre, of course, is continuing to say that the bill is fine now. We fixed it, and it was a bad bill before we made amendments to it. I'm not seeing any evidence of this. Do you see any evidence that this bill was in any way amended sufficiently to make it a good bill?
Well, there's a couple things there. One is, I mean, I'm torn, right? Because I like the idea that we're actually going to get things built, because I really feel like we've had a decade we had the lost decade where nothing got built. We didn't get our pipelines. Had we had the pipelines approved, 10 years ago, we would have had an east-west corridor. We would have had just so many more things happening. We would have had our product going to market. So on that side, you think, yeah, you'd like these things to be done efficiently and quickly. But on the other hand, you've got to really wonder about what does the government mean by national interest, because it's vague language. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to get pipelines built. It might mean that we're going to get wind turbines in Lake Erie, which, we had a moratorium on because, the public outcry was like, we don't want wind turbines on in our lakes. And so we know that Mark Carney is all in with net zero and with climate change action, which is fine for as long, for what it's worth. But, what does that mean in terms of our economy? What does that mean in terms of what kind of infrastructure we're going to be building? And we also know that the Carney Liberals, much like the Liberals before them, are always beholden to Quebec for their electoral seats, right? So are they going to disproportionately have things in the national interest that support Quebec over, say, Alberta? I mean, full disclosure, I still, even though I live in Ontario, I still feel like an Albertan because that's where I grew up and was raised. But there is a strong case to be made for the oil and gas sector. In fact, I think a strong environmental case to be made for it, because if you have it in the pipelines, it's actually lower emissions than if you're transporting it by rail or by truck, and you're certainly not receiving oil from regimes that don't have the same kind of environmental standards as we do if you're getting it, say, from Saudi Arabia, things like that. So I am torn by that. But the thing is, we don't know. What's been quite brilliant about Carney is that he has these great platitudes. He makes it sound like he's all in for Canada, but he never really answers a question directly, and we never know what direction we're going to go into. So a lot of it's going to depend on implementation. And I always sort of think about, if Carney were the leader of a different party, would he get the same pass as he has been right now by traditional media? Like, if his label were conservative rather than liberal, I wonder what the hue and cry would be in the national media. There's something about how we label politicians. And so whenever I'm thinking about policies, I try to put aside the labels that we put on them and say, okay, does this make sense on its face value? And so on face value, having so much centralized control over what is in the national interest is worrisome. Pushing out provincial leaders and not consulting with them, as well as Indigenous people, is a recipe for conflict in the future. And so it really depends on what's the strength of the people around the table that he's willing to consult with. And we don't know that as well. I mean, this last week where they had the First Minister's meetings, and he had meetings with Indigenous people, you don't get a really good sense of what those projects are going to be. All we know that there's going to be an office in place in September, but they're still lukewarm even about the idea of an east-west pipeline. And I saw that Wapkanu wasn't that in favor, that excited about it. So you have Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario saying yes, and then you've got Manitoba being a holdout. So will the federal government say to Manitoba, well, we need to go through your land to build this pipeline, or will there be some other thing in the national interest, such as EV mandates? Like, we just don't know.
I thought Carney very effectively co-opted the official opposition during the MP's 3 weeks back in school, which really what it amounted to before summer vacation started again. But are you saying then that the bill is still a bad bill in terms of its centralization of control, despite the endorsement of Pierre Poilievre in the Conservative Party?
Well, I think Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives are in a tough position because they even though they got the best showing they had even before Harper, the fact remains that they were seen as the losers in this, and so they know that Poilievre has this image problem, as I mentioned before, this image that he's too negative. So now he's got to play nice, and he's made statements such as we want Canada to succeed. So I think that was their good faith effort to allow, to say we want Canada to concede. But in doing so, they were probably hoping that the federal government is going to make good on its commitments to things like pipelines. I think that seemed to be at that time way back in June and just after the election, it seemed like there was a national consensus for pipelines. Whether that holds and whether this bill helps that, I think that's what they're hoping to happen. But we don't know. And so you got to be careful about this kind of legislation, that even though your intentions when you're trying to cooperate with the government may be X, the government might say, oh, well, now we've got carte blanche and we can do whatever we want. And that's the trap that they might have set for themselves for the Conservatives, that they should, that they might have been better to be more careful in not allowing the federal government to have so much centralized power. But perhaps they're also thinking, well, if we get in next time, then look at us, we'll have that central power. And that's the thing about politics, is that everyone people aren't exactly honest brokers, and they have their own self-interests about what they would like the legislation to look like once they're in power. And so maybe the Liberals did their bidding in an offhanded way.
But are you seeing any evidence that the Conservatives actually added any constructive amendments to this bill that would alleviate your concerns about it being over-centralization of the project management?
No, not in that part of it. And I mean, I agree that the issue, and again, this was part of the Conservatives' argument, and another one that the Liberals co-opted. Remember, the Liberals co-opted the Conservatives' platform, the getting rid of the carbon tax, certainly the whole rhetoric around that we have too much red tape, that we have too many gatekeepers. And so this did fit nicely with the Conservative strategy. So they're in a box, right? Because they had said all along, we have, the regulatory regime is too complex, it's too difficult to get anything built. And so the Liberals said, okay, how about this? And so anything that the Conservatives put out there, they were sort of tied by that language, but they're not thinking about, I don't think they were thinking about the bigger picture, about the centralization of control and the fact that we are putting more power in the hands of the PMO in particular. Because let's face it, it's Carney who's going to make those decisions, not the people around him.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. Wanted to mention, you talked about C-11, and of course that was highly controversial. But Bill C-36, the Online Harms Act, which did not pass because Parliament was prorogued, and then, of course, we went to an election. Bill C-36, I considered to be the most dangerous and odious piece of legislation the Trudeau government ever attempted to introduce. Mark Carney has obliquely talked about reintroducing this bill. He says he's worried about misinformation and disinformation and how this might affect the safety of children. Of course, is a complete non sequitur. This has got nothing to do with keeping children safe, but everything to do with keeping the airwaves safe for Liberals. Do you think that Bill C-36, if it's reintroduced by the Carney government, and I'm sure it will be, you think this poses a clear and present threat to democracy in this country, not to mention free speech in general?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, whenever people love, oh, let's save the children, right? Like, kids are watching stuff that you would make your I don't know, I can't even think of an analogy of the garbage that's out there. This bill isn't going to fix that. There's just it's just so easy to get content, but it certainly is a very good way for the government to control political speech. And let's remember that when they first introduced it, I can't remember how long ago because there's been so many iterations of it. The only the only political party that was found in contravention were the Liberals. They're very good at having platitudes and saying, oh, we can't have fake news, we can't have this and that, and then they bold-faced lie about their political opponents, yet they don't think there should be any consequences to them. So, I think that in a free society, people make misstatements, people lie, but it's also, I mean, as much as we can be critical of social media and critical of this new world, it's very democratizing, because if I said something outrageous, oh boy, am I going to hear about it. People are going to email me, they're going to go on X or any social media that they like, and they are just going to double down going, oh, what an idiot, blah blah blah, and that's their right to do so. And then it's up to me to defend myself, or to say, oh, my bad, I shouldn't have said that, or no, you guys are wrong, and I'm going to stand. That's a conversation. That's democracy. The problem, I think, for some is that it's just so out there and vocal, and people aren't savvy about how to differentiate between fact and fiction, and that's on us as citizens. Though we've got to learn how to do our own research. We got to learn to say, okay, even if I like something that I'm seeing on whatever channel, and that includes traditional media, because they don't get it right every time either. I did a whole career exposing how they got it wrong, or they only showed one side over another. So it's always incumbent upon the viewer to say, I'm going to double check this, or I'm going to see what other sources are saying the same thing, to see the veracity of it. And I don't think that's the job of the government to do so, because the government itself misleads. I think political leaders of all stripes massage the truth in many different ways to get to obviously to make their case, but that doesn't mean that they are the purveyors of truth in all instances. And so in a democracy, everyone needs to be able to have the right to call out misinformation and untruths where they see it, and it's not the job of the CRTC or the federal government to do so, to monitor that.
Couldn't agree more with that. And you alluded to how Mark Carney ran in the last federal election essentially as a prototype or a duplicate of Pierre Poilievre. He stole a lot of his policies. He talked the same talk. And at times it looked like the same speechwriter was writing the speeches for both of these men, especially after the election. It was almost scary. In fact, I would say Mark Carney almost patterned himself after other blue liberals like John Turner and Paul Martin, who were always sort of antidotes to the last very, very liberal prime minister. And I say that in a capital and a small sense as well. But since he's become prime minister, we've learned he has 103 different conflicts of interest. We've learned he has investments around the world. We don't know exactly how much he's worth, but we know he's making a heck of a lot of money off of green energy projects, that he's made a lot of money from being an insider as a globalist, as a former governor of the Bank of England, as a former governor of the Bank of Canada. He has his fingers in a lot of financial troughs. And he's also run up a $300 billion deficit since becoming prime minister. And this, of course, is something that would have frightened even Chrystia Freeland last December. She was concerned that $50 billion deficit was going to mean we're going off the fiscal cliff. Well, this is 6 times that we've gone off the fiscal cliff. Mark Carney's clearly not a small C conservative. He's really not a blue liberal. He's as woke as Justin Trudeau ever was. And I think this is all a game. This is all a charade. Just as it was a charade to suggest that he hated Donald Trump with a passion, the U.S. was the enemy, and he's going to fight them tooth and nail, when in fact he obviously seems to get along very well with Donald Trump. He admires Donald Trump to a large degree, and he's been totally ineffective in standing up to Donald Trump like he said he would be. So once again, play acting. But do you think Mark Carney is potentially going to be worse for the Canadian economy than Justin Trudeau was?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It'd be nice to see a budget. And I mean, they had to backtrack from that. Recall that, the finance minister, after their first cabinet meeting, said, "Oh, we're not going to have a budget this year." It's like, oh my God. And then a couple days later, Carney had to acquiesce and say, "Yeah, we'll have a fall budget, not just an economic statement." It's too soon to tell. I mean, you have these demands on the federal government, in part because of Trump and the tariffs and their need to shore up certain industries. You also have our new commitments for defense spending. So that's going to be a big ticket. But then at the same time, they're saying we're going to do across the board cuts, and there's going to be cuts to the public sector. So they're in for a bumpy ride. They're in for a bumpy ride from both the left and the right, and we'll just have to see how he does it. I mean, he certainly is a different kind of politician, and this is sort of what How Democracy Dies authors talk about. They said, got to be a little bit careful about outsiders, because the outsiders sort of run a wave of populism. They get people excited about them because they're outsiders, because they have sort of this business experience, but the political people in politics, in the party system, they allow that to happen because they think, oh, once this guy comes in, we'll be able to control them. And oftentimes they aren't able to control them because they have a life of their own. And so we'll have to see what happens with the Liberals under Mark Carney, if there's going to be rifts under. Are they a party that just wants to be in power, or are they a party of ideologues? When you look at his front bench and that famous picture of his new cabinet after they won election, the front row were all people who had been in Justin Trudeau's cabinet, who had been full-throated endorsements of carbon tax and all sorts of different initiatives that Carney threw out the window. So are they going to be putting pressure on him, or are they just saying, oh, we're glad we got the gig and we're going to stay in power with you? And if that's the case, if they're the latter, that they're not going to criticize him, that they're going to go full bore with him, then that's going to be a bit scary, because then he can basically do whatever he wants, and we'll just have to see who is in it for. Is he in it for the Canadian economy, the Canadian people, or is he in it for his globalist friends and his ideas?
Thank you for sharing this station with your friends and family. Thank you for hitting that like button, because I tell you, we are fighting back in a way I've never had to before, because I am going to keep this station on the air. I am going to keep fighting for freedom. I'm going to keep fighting for justice and truth, because that's all I have left. And I am damn determined to resist this Carney government in any way possible, as it encroaches upon our individual freedom. And it will continue to do that, mark my words. And that's why we're here today. I'll be back again tomorrow, same time, same place, 10 a.m. This has been David KRAYDEN, broadcasting live from our nation's capital in Ottawa. Thank you for watching. We'll see you again tomorrow.
You can't handle the truth.
Resolve to resist